Horror films have been around for almost as long as cinema has been around. They've had a long and engrossing history and have evolved continually since its invention. It all started back in the 1910s, when silent films were the prominent choice for movies. In fact, it was the only choice. And thus came about films like Les Vampires and The Cabinet of Dr. Calgary. And what makes the silent film genre of horror interesting is that it's very much focused on human, down-to-earth fears. Fears like the mob. In Les Vampires, it was a serialized 10-part series which focused not on the mythical creature vampires, but on the mob. And in The Cabinet of Dr. Calgary, it did not focus on a mad doctor, it focused more on mental health. Both of these things are very interesting because when you think of horror today, you think of the monsters and the creatures. But the human aspect did not last for long, as in the 1930s, once sound had come around, the universal monsters took the scene. And this really led us into the golden age of horror. Creatures like the creature from the Black Lagoon, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Frankenstein. In USA Today, they even published an article of Frankenstein Friends talking about the influence these monsters have on our pop culture today. It's fascinating to see how much we still remember these creatures, even years later. And one man was behind many of these creatures, Boris Karloff, who was the first person to ever make a career out of horror movies. He was truly an icon who played Frankenstein, the Mummy, and others among them. But then came the second age of horror films. And this was really led on by Alfred Hitchcock. When he started producing a serialized TV show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents in the 1950s, he began transitioning into horror. And thus came Psycho, which changed everything. Psycho terrified people because it was a handsome, kind, and seemingly good-natured person who suddenly turned psychotic and killed people. This shocked everyone. No one was ready for this, and this changed people's idea about horror because their idea of horror before was only the monsters. And thus, Alfred Hitchcock continued making films like The Birds. And Psycho led the path for the slasher genre, which started with Black Christmas. Many people believe this was started with the film series Halloween, but it was not. Black Christmas opened up several years prior, and it inspired Halloween. And Halloween inspired the entire genre of new monsters. And these monsters became even bigger icons than their predecessors. Figures like Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Leatherface, all of these came because of Halloween. These were the new generation of horror, and they were the first times that horror films had ever gotten multiple sequels because of fanfare. This is truly where the pop culture takes over. People began demanding these monsters everywhere. They wanted TV shows, they wanted merchandise. Horror became just this element. It was pushing and pushing and pushing it all throughout culture, and it couldn't be stopped. The 70s and 80s were truly the prime time to be a horror fan. But all things come to an end, and thus that leads us into the modern age. And the modern age was different than all the other ages. Just like everything else, things change. And thus, found footage became a new trend. Found footage interested many people because, as the Imaginators Journal said, it made you feel the presence of the killer because you were in the eyes of the victim. You were in the camera. It made you feel like you were there with them. And films like The Blair Witch Project really showed this. But what is the future of horror? The future of horror is many things. Like everything else, is constantly evolving. But if we look to the future, we can see that horror is now transitioning to not just movies, but to video games. And even more old series being picked up in TV series like Ash vs. Evil Dead. Horror will continue to evolve, and its fans will continue to evolve, and it will continue to have a rich history.